Hi, this is Charlie at Vintage Speed. Okay, this is the Rochester secondary carburetor, and it'll also be a video to show you how to install our 2-2 base conversion or our 3-2 base conversion kit on the Rochester. Okay, we've got our carburetor all cleaned. The first thing you want to do is the top screws are 1032, so you want to make sure that you run a 1032 tap through all your top screws and make sure that their threads are all good and that they're clean. And we run a long extended tap through our jet holes in the bottom and make sure that they're done correctly. And we also run a tap through the power valve hole to make sure that all your threads are clean and everything's been blown out. Okay, we're going to start with the body section here. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to install the cluster. Okay, the cluster, this is the pump check for the cluster. Now in our kits you'll find there's two of these balls. One of the balls is aluminum and the other one is steel. You want to make sure that you use the steel ball for your pump check valve. Also, I might add, double check on this real fine wire spring and make sure that you look at it, because a lot of times when they're sold or when you'll get them in kits, there'll be two springs stuck together and it's real hard to tell unless you hold it up and stretch it out a little bit and look at it. Make sure you only got a single spring, because if you put two springs on it, your pump check won't work. Your spring goes in, and then your little T-bar that holds all this together, that goes in. And if it doesn't want to stay in there, what you might have to do is take and just stake the sides of it just a little bit. That's the way the factory did it. Or we can use a little wider T-bar. These T-bars come in different sizes. Let me put a wider one in there. That little T-bar slips right down in those slots right there. And then you can take a little punch. Punch the T-bar down until it's flush, just like that right there. Okay, that's your pump check. Okay, on your clusters, there's 700 part numbers for the Rochester 2-barrel carburetor, so there's a lot of different parts and pieces. The most common clusters are what we call the early style cluster, and it uses this gasket, has a little scallop, and this is cut in, this indentation's cut way back in. That uses this gasket. And there's also the later style cluster is this wider cluster, and it uses the wider gaskets. You can tell by just looking at it which is which. So okay, let's talk about clusters. On this particular the carburetor, we're building a secondary carburetor, so we're not concerned about the idle circuits, because there are no idle circuits in this carburetor. So you can take these idle pickup tubes and just grasp them with a pair of pliers and pull those idle tubes right out of the cluster. You don't need them. So just pull your idle tubes right out. Now the things you want to be concerned with is you want to be concerned with your squirter holes that are right here. The best thing to use to clean these is either a torch tip cleaner, or the instance what we're using is a real small spring that's the size of the hole. So punch those out, and also punch out these holes right here. Make sure that they're clean all the way through, because those are the air bleeds for your main cluster, and there's one on each side. So clean those out and make sure they're clean. And then you can blow everything out on your cluster and make sure it's done. You don't really have to be concerned about these holes. This is the bleed for the idle, and you're not going to be using an idle circuit, so it doesn't matter if they're even there. On the original tri-powers, this wasn't even drilled through, so don't worry about those. Okay, now this uses the early style cluster, so we're going to put the cluster gasket on. I might add also that most of these carburetors came with these anti-bubble tubes that go in here. I haven't found that they ever did any good. They were designed to keep air bubbles from getting on the side of of the holes, and they actually fit down in here like so. If you want to use them, that's fine. You can put them in if you don't want to use them. And if you don't happen to have them and you want them, I have them on the catalog. All right, we're ready to install our cluster. Now we've checked all our screw holes and made sure our screw holes were clean. Put our cluster in there. Okay, our cluster uses two 832 Philister head screws, and you get the two long ones that go in here, and you get this special cluster screw that goes in this front hole. It has a little hard fiber washer which comes in the kit. If you notice, there's no threads up here, and the body of the screw is undercut. And the reason for that is because the fuel flows around this to go out your squirters. So make sure that gasket's on there, and then once you get everything on, you can go ahead and tighten your cluster down. I usually bring them down till they're snug. Make sure it's sitting on their level, and then once you get them down where they're snug, then you can go ahead and tighten them down. Okay. Remember, on a secondary carburetor, of the 5 circuits that are in a carburetor, you have the float circuit, you have the choke circuit, you have the idle circuit, you have the main circuit, and you have the power circuit. The only thing that we're going to be using in this is the float circuit, the accelerator pump, and the main circuits. We're not using any power circuits or any idle circuits. So when you get our kit, it'll have a power valve plug in it like this. It has a little gasket on it, and this power valve is plugged, and this inserts in the center hole right down there. And you want to use, if you've got it available, you want to use a special tool to put the power valve in. It's not necessary on this carburetor because the pin's not in it, but if you're doing a primary carb, you want to make sure that you use the proper tool to put it in, because if you bend that pin, it won't seat and the car will run real rich. So what we use, if you don't have a power valve wrench, you can take a wide blade screwdriver the width of the head of your power valve and grind a notch in it, and then you can go ahead and that pin will fit down in that notch and it won't bottom out. Okay, now we're going to put the jets in. These carburetors flow in the center of the fuel curve with a 55 jet at sea level. So we're going to install our jets in here. And generally, you don't have to worry too much about changing your jets on the outside carburetors. If you're at real high altitude, we'll drop them down a little bit. If you like to live in Denver, Colorado, where you're a mile high, it might be necessary to drop them down a little bit. But generally, most of the time, 55s are fine. If you kick down on it and you're at high altitude, it will black smoke a little bit, so you can change them. The center carburetor is where we do our jet changes. Okay. Remember, don't tighten those jets down too tight. Think about the next guy that might be rebuilding it, and it may be you. So this stuff, it just has to be down snug tight, not tight. All right. Okay, we've got our power valve plug in, we've got our jets in, and we've got our cluster in. This particular carburetor didn't have a vacuum port on it, so some of them do. If that hole is there for the ported vacuum in the carburetor, you can leave it there because our aluminum throttle body's not drilled through, so there's not going to be any vacuum applied to it anyway. Cosmetically, we normally put a little plug in them, but other than that, there's your bowl assembly. Okay, now we're going to go to the top. There's basically several different types of needle and seats. The standard needle and seat uses a needle with a seat assembly like this, and it uses a little Viton or Buna rubber tip on it. In some areas these work good, in other areas they're not so good because of the fuel additives. So we use what's called a roto disc, and instead of using, it's a captured deal, and instead of using a needle, it has a little Teflon wafer in there that shuts the fuel off, and we find these work much better under conditions, especially if you live in a spot where you've got a lot of additives in your fuel. That meaning California being the worst, closely followed by Oregon and Washington State, and the large population centers on the East Coast, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Connecticut, New York in there. They put an awful lot of ketone and benzene in the gas to make the catalytic converters burn hotter, and they are very destructive to anything that's Buna rubber or Viton. So we try to stay away from that needle and seat when we can. Okay, next we're gonna, since this is a secondary carburetor, we won't be using a choke on this. So that all we're gonna do next, the power valve piston would normally go right here. You can just leave it out. You don't have to worry about it. There's no vacuum coming up to this port that feeds the power valve, so it's blocked off anyway, so you don't have to worry about it. So now our pump circuit. There's several different styles of these actuator cams for your pump. If you've got a core, it's probably got the correct one in it. What you want to make sure on these, number one, is that this is tight and you don't get a whole lot of wobble in it. If you do get a lot of wobble in it, we offer a bushing for this that you drill it, tap the bushing in, and this is 1/4 inch, and then it'll tighten this up. The other thing is you don't want to have a lot of play this way, so we offer these little nylon spacer gaskets like this that you can put on the shaft, and what that does is it moves that arm out just enough that you don't end up with anything any slack side to side in it. That tightens everything right up for you. So go ahead and put your arm on there. Okay. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to install the pump. Okay, all of our pumps that we use fluoroelastomer cups, which are synthetic, and they're resistant to the fuel additives today. They work very good. Never use a black Buna rubber cup or any black cup on any of these pumps. If you do, you'll have problems with it. Okay, we have our delayer spring that goes on the pump like that, and then you compress this like so, and the little clip that goes over, and there's your delayer spring on your pump. Okay, next we're going to go ahead and insert our pump in the hole. And some of these are held on with a cotter pin, some of them are held on with an E-clip, and some of them are held on with a hairpin clip. This particular one uses a hairpin clip. So once you put it on, put your hairpin clip in there to make sure that that's secure and doesn't come out. It actually really almost can't come out anyway because it's centered in the pump well, so it would have to actually be bent to come out. All right, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to install our top gasket. And our top gasket goes on, and there's locator pins for that top gasket. You press it down in. These all come in our kits. There's a locator pin here and a locator pin here. Okay, our fuel inlet's tight. How did that happen? Okay, our fuel inlet's tight. We make sure it's snug. Okay, and we're going to install our float. Okay, our float goes here with the float pin. I have floats brand new, and I have them in brass and I have them in nitrofill. Okay, let's talk float drop. When you're using this type of needle and seat, you're not concerned with float drop. And the reason I say that is this tang right here is what controls float drop. All you need that float to do is open far enough that when you open it up, you can look in the little window in the side and see that little Teflon wafer that's in there dropped down and opened up, which it does. That's your drop. Now your float level is critical. That has to be set. And the correct setting for these, if your engine is fairly level, you set this at 3/4 of an inch. From this little rough edge on the bottom of that float where it's soldered together, you'll feel there's a rough edge there. Set your float level so that little bottom ledge is right even with that level. Now, if you got some down tilt to your motor, that's going to tilt this carburetor heavy to the cluster side, so that since the fuel doesn't care anything about anything except gravity, it's going to load this cluster heavy to this side of the carburetor. So if you've got some down tilt to your tri-power, but you can lay a level across it and check it. Then what you want to do is you want to make sure you may want to raise this flow to 1/16 of an inch to get this level down to a correct level, because it's only seeing this side over your jets where the level is. And you've got to have room in that bowl, or you'll get a phenomenon of what we call thermal perk or hot start. And that's been around since carburetors were in existence. What that is when this carburetor is running, it's really cold due to evaporation. As soon as you shut the car off, the manifold starts absorbing heat, and it'll warm the fuel in the bowl. And since gas expands rapidly when you warm it, if you've ever put a red gas can out into your yard and left it, you see it swells up like a balloon. Well, that's exactly what happens in this carburetor. What it'll do is it'll raise the fuel level in the bowl, and the fuel will drip over the clusters, and you'll get what we call hot start. That's where you have to hold your gas pedal to the floor and crank and crank and crank to crank it up. And then as long as it's running, it'll run okay until the next time you shut it off. So make sure that those carbs are relatively level, and if they are a little bit tilted, you want to adjust that float so that it compensates for that drop. Okay, we've got our drop set. You want to at least have enough drop in this float. You don't want this to hit the bottom of the bowl. But it's not necessary to be concerned with float drop, because this type of fuel inlet valve is captured. In other words, the needle can't fall out. If you're using this type of needle and seat, if you get your float drop too low, the needle will come out and it'll jam up, and you'll be out of business. So, but with this one, you don't have to worry about it. All you have to worry about is setting your level correctly. Okay, we've got that top installed, and the next thing we're going to do is we're going to check and make sure our squirters are working good on this carburetor. And the way we do that is we always use mineral spirits or paint thinner to do your check. And the reason for that is because gasoline, of course, is flammable, and if you're working in a shop, so just insert a pump down in there and push on the pump, and you should see a good squirt coming out of your squirters, just like that right there. That's telling me that my squirters are working fine. So once that's done, you can blow out that carb bowl. All right, and now we are ready to put our top on. What I usually do on this, make sure your lineup pins are in place, your float levels adjusted, your pump circuit's hooked up. Take a little oil and oil your pump cup, and I always put a little oil down in the pump well, and then go ahead and put your top on. Okay, the top on these carburetors are held on by 8 screws. They're 1032 by 1 inch, except for the screw that goes right here in this high part, and that's a 1032 by 1.5 inches. So I usually go ahead and put that screw in and tighten it down, and then your other screws if we're doing the rebuild for you, we use all plated hardware and all new stainless steel screws. We don't put any used screws back in the carburetor. You notice this is a secondary, so it doesn't have a choke. Okay, so once you get your screws in there, you can go ahead and, we'll use the drill to speed things up. You can just use a screwdriver. Just run them down, don't run them down tight, because I want to show you how you tighten these screws. Okay, the proper way to tighten these screws is you have your lock washer on there. What you want to do is you want to tighten your screw down, and just until it crushes the lock washer. And when it crushes the lock washer, the screw will come to a stop. When it comes to a stop, give it 1/4 of a turn, and that's all you need. You don't want to tighten it down. People think they have to tighten these down because the fuel will leak, but it won't, because there's no fuel up here. The fuel is down in the bowl. The only time you get fuel up around this gasket is if you go around a corner or you hit your brakes real hard and it splashes some up there. Otherwise, it won't. You won't have any fuel up on the top. So remember, never over tighten these. It's not as critical on this carburetor because these are not notorious for the tops warping. But if you're doing a Stromberg or a Holley, you want to make darn sure that that you don't tighten them down too tight, or else you'll warp the top. Okay, let's talk about, there's some of these carburetors come with this idle vent tube, which allowed air to come into the thing when this little cam came back to your idle position. That's GM's engineers came up with some brainy stuff on some of these. Some of them had a hot air compensator valve back here that can be plugged if you got it on there. You don't need it. You don't need this. We just put a plug in it. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to install. We supply these in the kit. This is a little plug that goes in here. And the way we put them in to keep them in is put your plug in about halfway there, and take and put just a dab of Loctite on it and push the plug in. And that'll stay in there. That blocks off your choke hole so you don't suck air through that's not filtered with your air cleaner. Okay. All right, now we're ready to install our base. Okay, this is the easy part because I've done all the work for you. Our aluminum throttle bodies are all CNC machined. We make this entire throttle body. These plates are actually lapped in, and the reason I say they're lapped in is because they're lapped in on a machine that I developed just to do this. If you look down there, you can see the lap mark. It's just like the lap on a valve. We actually cut these plates a couple thousandths larger than the bore, and we lap them in so you get no air around them. This uses a wide throttle plate, and this throttle plate is cut on a 14-degree angle, where your stock throttle plate's cut on a 5-degree angle or a 6-degree angle. The reason we cut them there is because the throttle plate is actually a little bit egg-shaped, and what it does is it lets the throttle close 75% closed to the relation to the bore rather than being closed 90 degrees. If you tried to use a stock throttle body as a secondary carburetor, those plates are 3/1000 smaller than the bore, so you're going to get air around them. If you jam them tight that you shut off most of the air with a stock throttle body, you can't get the throttle body back open. So this is the way to do it. All right. Also, we use a thick gasket on here. Our gaskets are thick, and we like that because they seem to work better for us. Okay, you can install your base, and it's held on by 3 number 12 screws. I will tell you this, we have these screw kits. It is very difficult to find this screw right here. Number 12 screws are just about a thing of the past in the industry. It's almost impossible to find them. So we have these screws if you need them. And get me a smaller washer there. Okay, once you get your gasket in place, go ahead and tighten your base down. And you can pretty well tighten this down. This uses a number 3, the large Phillips. And you can pretty well come down on these pretty tight. These screws are pretty heavy duty, and you want that base tight because remember, you'll get a vacuum leak between there if you don't. Okay, there we've got our throttle body installed on the carburetor. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to install the pump rod on this side. And there's several different variations of these pump rods, and there's several different variations of these cams. When you take if you've got a good core, when you take your carburetor apart, you should be able to see what you've got. If you need any of these parts or pieces, I have them all. Okay, once your pump rod is put in, there's a little number 8 flat washer that goes there, and this little cotter pin goes through. What you want to make sure on your pump rod is that you're getting a full stroke. If you're not getting a full stroke, which this one's is not getting quite a full stroke, okay, then what we're going to do, and I could have checked that before I put this on, but if you're not getting a full stroke, you need to lengthen this arm. And the way you lengthen this arm is you take the bend out of it. So set it down and just tap it and take some of the bend out of it. That way okay, that's better. These pumps and these carburetors that we use today are not leather. They're self-loading. If you've got an early carburetor like 55 to 59, and there's a couple models of the later ones that used a leather pump, and they had a little ball down in the bottom of the pump well that led out, and there was a little screen around it that drew the fuel from the bowl, and it was held in by the return spring. We don't put a return spring under the secondary carb. We put it under the primary carb, under the pump. And the reason for that is because you've got the spring return on this base, and this carburetor snaps back so good without it, you don't need to worry about it. Plus the fact, if you put that additional spring pressure under there, it makes your linkage harder to open. So you don't need the spring that's under the pump rod. Goes on, your cotter key goes in, make sure everything's working fine. Okay, we've got our pump circuit, our main circuit, and our float circuit. Now we're going to install our fuel inlet. I offer these fuel inlets new in nickel and brass, and I offer them in 1/4 inch NPT, which is a size you never find. We have to actually drill these and tap them. We offer them in 1/8 inch pipe. We offer them in 1/4 inch pipe. We offer them 5/16 inverted flare if you're going to use the flared fuel line. We offer them in 3/8 inverted flare if you're going to use a larger line. Okay, this fuel inlet is comprised of the inlet, and if you notice, we use a nylon gasket on that. Then there's a little filter gasket that goes in here like so. Then you insert the centered bronze filter. You always put the open end towards where the fuel's coming in. Okay, you have a spring here that holds all this in once this is together and holds it tight. So put that in there, and then put your fuel valve up. And go ahead and tighten it down. Take you a 1-inch wrench. And tighten it down tight, but don't snug down on it too tight, because these are bad about stripping out inside. If they do strip out, we offer a fuel inlet that has long threads on it, so it'll go inside and catch the threads. But if you use the nylon gasket, all you've got to do is just tighten it down tight, and then you're ready to accept your inlet. And this is filtered fuel going to the needle and seat. Okay, this type base uses a tri-power gasket just like the original ones. This particular gasket, you can put it on either way, it doesn't matter. We call these the rectangular bases. The bolt pattern is the same as the other base on this primary carburetor. The holes are the same, but the gasket is different. So there's your build on your Rochester secondary carb. And so if you're putting one of our base installation kits on, it'll come with the power valve plug. It'll come with the it'll come with all the parts that you need for your primary carb. It'll come with everything, the jetting package, everything that you need to assemble the carb. All you have to do is make sure that your bowl and your top is clean, and your accessory parts are clean. You can do whatever you want with the old base you take off. You're not going to be needing that because this replaces it. So there's your secondary carb rebuilt. Everything should snap back just like normal, and there's instruction videos that show you how to adjust your linkage and stuff once this is put on a manifold. So I think that pretty much concludes the Rochester build on the secondary carb. Actually, the secondary carbs are easier to do than the primary because you're only using a couple of circuits and everything else is plugged off. If you need help, you can call me. I'm Charlie. Our company's Vintage Speed. It's 772-778-0809. We're in Florida. Or you can order any parts you want for this carburetor off of our online catalog, www.vintagespeed.com. Thank you and good luck.